There's a bone harpoon sitting in a museum in Leiden, Netherlands. Not much to look at, really. 15 centimetres long, carved from deer antler, 6 barbs cut into one side with stone tools. But here's what makes it extraordinary. A fishing trawler called the Kalinda pulled it up from the bottom of the North Sea in 1931, tangled in nets that had been dragging across the seafloor 120 kilometres from the nearest coast. The harpoon was covered in barnacles wrapped in ancient mud. Carbon dating would eventually show it was made 11,000 years ago. Which raises an interesting question. Why was someone fishing in the middle of the North Sea 11,000 years ago? The answer is simple, and it changes everything. They weren't in the middle of the sea. They were standing on dry land, on a riverbank probably. Maybe at the edge of a lake, because 11,000 years ago there was no North Sea, not the way we know it. Between Britain and mainland Europe there was a country, an actual country, larger than many modern nations, rolling hills and river valleys, forests and grasslands, coastlines and marshes. Tens of thousands of people lived there. They hunted, fished, gathered, raised families, created art, developed technologies. They had no idea they were living in a place that would one day be remembered as Doggerland, the land that drowned. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make it. So subscribe maybe, and leave a comment telling me where you are. Manchester at midnight, Copenhagen at dawn, all of us wondering about the drowned lands beneath the North Sea. This isn't mythology. This isn't Atlantis or some fantasy about lost civilizations with impossible technologies. This is documented, mapped, studied. We have the artifacts. We have sonar images of the river valleys and hills. We have pollen cores that tell us what plants were growing there. We have the tools that human hands shaped, the bones of animals they hunted. We have proof that for thousands of years, the centre of prehistoric Europe wasn't underwater. It was paradise. And then, over the course of millennia, the sea swallowed it whole. Every valley, every forest, every settlement. Gone. Drowned. Waiting in the darkness beneath 100 metres of cold North Sea water. This is the story of Doggerland, of the people who lived there, thrived there, and eventually had to watch their entire world disappear beneath the waves, of how we found it again, and of what it means that an entire country can simply cease to exist. Picture a landscape that no longer exists. Go back 12,000 years, to a time when the last ice age is ending, but the world hasn't yet settled into the geography we know today. Stand on a hill in what will one day be the middle of the North Sea, but right now, right here, it's just a hill, one of thousands. The view stretches for miles in every direction. To the west, more hills rolling toward what will eventually be the British Isles, but are currently just the western highlands of this vast plain. To the east, the land slopes gradually toward the forests of what will become Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands. But those names don't exist yet. Those borders don't exist. There's just land. Continuous, unbroken land. The sky is enormous out here. No mountains block the horizon. Just endless rolling topography under a dome of blue. If you're here in spring, the air smells like new grass and wet earth. The winter has been mild. Not like the brutal cold your grandparents talked about, back when the ice sheets still covered the north. The world is warming. The glaciers are retreating, and this land, this perfect temperate zone between the retreating ice and the forests of the south, this is where life is flourishing. Below your hill, a river winds through a broad valley. Not a massive river like the ones that drain whole continents, but substantial. Wide enough that you'd need a boat to cross it comfortably. The water is clear, running over gravel beds. You can see fish moving in the shallows. Pike, probably. Perch. Maybe salmon if you're lucky and it's the right season. The river is one of dozens that drain this land, carrying snowmelt and rainfall north and west toward the Atlantic, or east toward the great river that will one day be called the Rhine, but is currently just the main artery of this world, cutting through the heart of Doggerland. The valley floor is a mix of open grassland and scattered trees, birch mostly, some oak, willows along the riverbanks. This isn't dense forest. The landscape is too open for that, too influenced by the grazing of massive herbivores. Even from up here you can see them. Oroch, wild cattle, but nothing like the domestic cows you're familiar with. These are enormous animals, bulls standing 2 meters at the shoulder, with forward curving horns that could gore a wolf. A small herd is grazing near the river, maybe a dozen animals, their dark coats visible against the green grass. Further out, moving along the ridge of another hill, you spot a group of red deer. elk even larger than the auroch, their massive antlers catching the light. In the distance, something else. Bigger. You squint. It could be a mammoth. They're rare now, retreating north with the cold, but occasionally you still see them. Living fossils from an age that's passing. The great herds that dominated the Ice Age are thinning, disappearing, being replaced by species better adapted to this new warmer world, but for now, for this brief window in time, they overlap. The old world and the new, existing side by side. The ecosystem here is absurdly rich. Think about what makes a landscape productive. You want water, obviously. This land has it in abundance. Rivers everywhere, streams cutting through every valley, marshes in the low areas, lakes scattered across the territory. You want diverse habitats. Forest and grassland, wetland and dryland, coast, and interior. Doggerland has all of it, sometimes within walking distance. You want moderate climate. Not too hot, not too cold, enough rainfall, but not too much. Perfect. The latitude here, roughly between 50 and 55 degrees north, in a warming world with ocean currents bringing mild Atlantic weather, creates ideal conditions. Winters are cool, but not deadly. Summers are warm, but not scorching. Spring and fall last for months. And this creates something remarkable. An abundance that's hard to overstate. The rivers are full of fish. The forests are full of game. The grasslands support vast herds. The coasts, when you can reach them, are thick with shellfish, seals, waterfowl. Hazelnuts grow everywhere in the fall, so many you could feed a family for weeks just from gathering. Berries in summer, roots and tubers year-round if you know where to look. This isn't a land where humans struggle to survive. This is a land where humans thrive. And they do. They're here, not everywhere, not densely packed like a modern country, but scattered across the landscape in seasonal camps and semi-permanent settlements. Small groups, extended families mostly, 20 or 30 people moving together through the annual cycle. They know this land intimately. Every valley, every river crossing, every stand of nut trees, every good fishing spot. They know because their parents knew, and their parents before them. People have been living here for thousands of years, ever since the ice retreated and made this land habitable. They're Mesolithic peoples. The Middle Stone Age, archaeologists call it. The period after the Ice Age hunter-gatherers but before farming arrived from the south. And that label, Stone Age, does them a disservice. It makes them sound primitive. But these people have technologies that would take you years to master. They can start fire in any weather. They can track a deer for days and know exactly where it's going. They can identify hundreds of plant species and know which ones are edible, which ones are medicinal, which ones will kill you if you prepare them wrong. They can read the landscape like you read a book. A broken branch tells a story. Tracks in mud are a narrative. The flight pattern of birds reveals where predators are lurking. Their tools are sophisticated, specialized. They don't just chip rocks randomly. They understand lithic technology, the science of stone. They know that certain types of flint from certain regions nap differently, produce sharper edges, last longer. They trade for good stone, sometimes from hundreds of kilometers away. They create composite tools, multiple materials working together. A spear isn't just a stick. It's a carefully selected wooden shaft, a stone point shaped for maximum penetration, binding made from sinew or plant fiber, sometimes a socket carved from antler to absorb impact. Every tool is the result of accumulated knowledge spanning generations, and it's not just about survival. They have art. We know because we've found it at contemporary sites elsewhere. Carved antler decorated with geometric patterns, beads made from shells and amber, brought from distant coasts worn as ornaments, ochre, red and yellow iron oxide ground into powder and used for painting things we can only imagine, bodies maybe, hides, ritual objects. The use of ochre is universal in human cultures of this period. It means something. It has significance beyond mere function. These people have culture, belief systems, ways of understanding the world that go beyond eating and sleeping. The scale of Doggerland is hard to grasp from a modern map. When you look at the North Sea today, it's just water. Featureless, boring, occasionally storm-tossed. But 12,000 years ago, this was territory roughly the size of Great Britain. More than 100,000 square kilometres. Picture that. Picture an area larger than Ireland, larger than Scotland, larger than the Netherlands, just gone, drowned, turned into seafloor. But it's not featureless seafloor. The land is still there, underneath. The hills are still hills, just underwater hills. The river valleys are still valleys, filled with water and sediment but retaining their basic shape. And this is important. This is how we know what we know, because modern technology, sonar mapping, seismic surveys borrowed from oil exploration, can see through the water, can create maps of the drowned landscape that show us exactly what it looked like. And what it looked like was beautiful. The central region was relatively flat, a plain crossed by rivers, with the main channel of the Rhine system running through it like an artery. To the west, the land rose into hills that connected to the British uplands. To the north, more low country gradually giving way to marshes and then coast. To the east, the land merged seamlessly with what would become the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany. And to the south, the landscape was bounded by a coastline, because even 12,000 years ago the Atlantic Ocean and what would become the English Channel existed. But they were far, far south of where they are now. The coastlines themselves would have been incredibly productive. Imagine miles of estuary where rivers meet the sea, mixing fresh water and salt water, creating brackish zones where both ecosystems meet. These transitional zones are biological hotspots, shellfish beds that seem inexhaustible, fish runs, seasonal migrations of salmon or sturgeon heading upriver to spawn, seabird colonies on cliffs and islands, seals hauling out on beaches, everything concentrated, accessible, predictable. For the people living here, this was more than just a good place to live. This was the place, the centre of their world. You have to understand human populations in Mesolithic Europe were small, scattered, mobile. Most regions could support maybe a few hundred people across hundreds of square kilometres, but Doggerland, with its incredible resource diversity and density, could support more. Population estimates are tentative, but some researchers think tens of thousands of people called this place home. Not all at once in one place, but scattered across the territory in their seasonal rounds, and they weren't isolated. This was a crossroads. People from the west, from the British uplands, would travel east into Doggerland seasonally. People from the Baltic regions to the north would move south. People from the great forests of Central Europe would travel northwest. They would meet here, trade here, share information here, probably intermarry here. Doggerland wasn't a backwater, it was a hub, the meeting point of multiple populations, a place where genetic lineages mixed and cultural innovations spread. The climate stability was key. For thousands of years, from roughly 10,000 BCE to 8,000 BCE, conditions were remarkably consistent. Warm enough to be comfortable, cool enough to avoid drought, wet enough to keep rivers flowing, dry enough to avoid constant flooding. This stability allowed populations to grow, knowledge to accumulate, traditions to develop. The same campsites were visited year after year, generation after generation. Certain valleys became known as good hunting grounds. Certain river crossings became traditional meeting places. The land acquired meaning beyond its physical properties. It became home in the deepest sense, and the people had no reason to think it would ever be anything else. Sure, the stories the elders told mentioned that the world used to be colder, that the winters were harsher in their grandparents' time. But it was getting better, not worse. The climate was improving. The hunting was good. The land was generous. Why would that ever change? They had no concept of sea level rise, no understanding of ice sheets melting far to the north, releasing unimaginable volumes of water into the oceans. No way to know that the ground beneath their feet, this solid, reliable land, was actually a shallow depression that existed only because global sea levels were artificially low. They couldn't know that they were living on borrowed time, that their paradise was temporary, that every generation, slowly, invisibly, the ocean was creeping closer, and that eventually, inevitably, it would take everything. So who were these people, really? Not in the abstract sense of archaeological periods and cultural classifications, but as humans. As individuals who woke up cold on winter mornings, who laughed at jokes we'll never understand, who felt love and fear and pride. Who were they? Start with what we know for certain. They were anatomically modern humans, identical to you in every biological way. Same brain capacity, same physical capabilities, same emotional range. If you could somehow transport an infant from Doggerland 12,000 years ago into the present, raise them in a modern family, they'd grow up completely indistinguishable from anyone else. They'd learn to read, use smartphones, understand calculus. Because the difference between them and us isn't biological, It's technological, cultural, accumulated knowledge. They weren't less intelligent, they just knew different things, and what they knew was survival in a world without grocery stores, without metal tools, without written instructions. They knew how to live in direct relationship with their environment in ways that would humble most modern people. Drop an average person from the 21st century into Mesolithic Doggerland with nothing but the clothes on their back, and they'd probably die within a week. Starvation, hypothermia, infection, predation. Take your pick. Drop a Mesolithic person into Times Square and sure, they'd be confused, but they'd survive. Humans are adaptable. The evidence for who they were comes from multiple sources. Obviously, we have the artifacts pulled from the North Sea floor. Trawlers have been dredging them up for over a century now. The bone harpoon from the Kalinda was just the first recognised piece. Since then, thousands of objects have been recovered. Most end up in private collections, fishermen keeping interesting things they find in their nets. But enough have made it to museums and research institutions that we can reconstruct a fairly detailed picture of their material culture. The worked flint is everywhere. Well, everywhere in Doggerland sediments. Scrapers, which are exactly what they sound like. Tools for scraping hide, removing flesh from skin, preparing leather. The edge is carefully shaped, curved to fit comfortably in the hand, sharp enough to slice through tissue but not so delicate that it breaks. Burins, which are more specialised. These are chisels, essentially. You use them for engraving bone or antler, for carving, for detailed work. The business end comes to a strong point, reinforced by the way the flint is knapped. Then there are blades, long thin pieces struck from prepared cores. These could be used as is, or they could be modified into specific tools. Many show signs of hafting, tiny scratches and polish, from being bound into wooden or bone handles. And then there are microliths. These are tiny geometric pieces of flint, triangles and crescents, rarely more than a centimetre or two across. They look almost like decorative pieces, but they're intensely practical. You'd set them into a groove carved along a wooden or bone shaft, creating a composite tool, a spear with multiple cutting edges, an arrow, once bow technology developed, a knife with replaceable blades. The genius of microliths is that they're modular. Break one blade, replace it. Lose your spear, you still have the microliths to make another. It's sophisticated design thinking. The bone and antler work is even more impressive. Antler is remarkable material. It's strong but workable, holds a point better than bone, doesn't splinter as easily as wood. Red deer antler was preferred, and there were plenty of red deer in Doggerland. The barbed points are the most common finds. These are harpoons, really, though we usually call them projectile points or fish spears. The barbs are carefully carved, angled backward so that once the point enters flesh, it doesn't come out easily. Some have a single row of barbs, others have 2 rows, opposing each other. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. You can see individual tool marks where the maker used a flint burin to carve each barb, shaping it, thinning it, making sure it was strong enough to hold but sharp enough to penetrate. These weren't made quickly. An experienced craftsperson might spend hours on a single point, selecting the right piece of antler, using fire or soaking to soften it if needed, then carefully removing material, checking the balance, the symmetry, the sharpness, creating a tool that their life might depend on. Because when you're spearing a large fish or throwing at a swimming deer, your tool has to work perfectly. There's no second chance. But here's what's remarkable. We've found these artifacts in the North Sea, yes, pulled from sediments that were once dry land. But we've also found virtually identical tools at terrestrial sites in Britain and continental Europe, sites like Starcar in Yorkshire, which dates to around 9000 BCE. This was a lakeside settlement, where Mesolithic peoples built a platform out into the water, probably for fishing or for accessing waterfowl. The artefact assemblage is nearly identical to what's been recovered from Doggerland. The same types of barbed points, the same flint tools, the same manufacturing techniques. Or Howick in Northumberland, where archaeologists found the remains of a substantial wooden structure. The post holes were still there, showing where large timber posts had been set into the ground in a rough circle, probably supporting a conical roof. This wasn't a crude lean-to. This was engineered shelter, designed to withstand coastal weather, large enough for an extended family group. Radiocarbon dating put it at around 7800 BCE. The structure probably stood for decades, returned to seasonally, maintained across generations. And this gives us a window into Doggerland, because the people at Starcar, the people at Howick, and the people in Doggerland were the same culture. They were probably related, they definitely traded with each other, shared technologies, maybe spoke related languages. So when we find evidence at terrestrial sites of wooden structures, of hearths built in specific ways, of food processing techniques, we can reasonably assume similar things existed in Doggerland. We just can't excavate them because they're underwater, buried under meters of sediment, protected by fishing restrictions and oil exploration zones, and the sheer logistical difficulty of underwater archaeology. But seismic surveys, the same technology oil companies use to map subsurface geology, have given us hints. In the areas of the southern North Sea, geophysicists have identified what appear to be wooden structures in the sediment. Linear features, too regular to be natural, the right size and spacing to be post holes or the remains of timber platforms. These haven't been excavated. We've just seen them on sonar, but they're there, waiting. Imagine you're one of these people. Let's say you're a young adult, maybe 20 years old, which is fairly young by Mesolithic standards. Many people live into their 40s or 50s if they survive childhood. You're part of a band of about 25 people, 3 or 4 extended families travelling together. There's safety in numbers, and the social network is crucial for survival. You share knowledge, share resources, share labour. When someone kills a large animal, everyone eats. When someone gets sick, everyone helps. It's early autumn. The hazelnuts are ripe. Your band has travelled to a valley you visit every year at this time because there's a hillside thick with hazel trees and the harvest is always good. You've been here for 2 weeks now, and every day you've been gathering. The nuts are dense calories, crucial for getting through winter. You crack them with stones, store them in baskets woven from plant fibres. Some you'll eat now, some you'll bury in pits to preserve them. If you do it right, dig in well-drained soil, they'll last for months. But you're not just gathering. The men have been hunting. There's a deer trail nearby, a route the herds use when moving between feeding areas. 2 days ago, they brought back a red deer stag. A good kill. The butchering took hours. Everyone participated. The hide was carefully removed and stretched for tanning. The meat was divided, some eaten fresh, some dried over smoky fires to preserve it. The bones were broken open for marrow, one of the richest food sources available. The antlers were set aside for tool-making. Nothing was wasted. You've been working on a new spear point, actually. There's a core of good flint that was traded from somewhere to the south. Distinctive grey stone that naps beautifully. You've been striking blades from it, and yesterday you got a perfect piece, long and straight. You're hafting it now, using a split piece of hazel wood as the shaft, binding the blade in place with sinew from the deer, coating it with birch pitch for waterproofing. The pitch is sticky, annoying to work with, but once it sets, the binding will be incredibly strong. This spear is for fishing. There's a river nearby, and the salmon should be running soon, heading upstream to spawn. When they do, you'll be ready. Your toolkit is extensive. You carry it with you always, either on your person or in a bag made from deer hide. Fire-starting materials, flint and pyrite that spark when struck together, dried tinder that catches easily. A scraper for hide work, several microliths that can be mounted in different configurations, a bone awl for punching holes in leather, some sinew for binding, a small container of ochre mixed with fat used for treating hide and probably for body decoration during certain rituals or gatherings. Every tool has been made by hand, either by you or by someone in your band, or traded from another group. The trade networks are extensive. That flint you're using? It probably came from at least 200 kilometers away. Someone napped it into a core, transported it north, traded it for something else, amber beads maybe, or sealskins, and eventually it ended up with your band. The amber everyone wears, small beads pierced and strung on plant fibre cords, came from even farther away. Baltic amber, fossilized tree resin from the northern coasts. It's beautiful, warm golden colours, and it's valuable. Not because it's useful, but because it's rare, exotic, meaningful. Wearing amber says something about you, about your connections, your trading relationships, your status within the social network, and that social network extends across Doggerland and beyond. Over your lifetime, you'll meet hundreds of people. Some you'll see regularly, bands that share the same seasonal rounds, intersecting at certain times of year. Others you'll meet rarely, groups from distant territories who travel different routes. But you'll recognize them as kin, similar people, speaking languages you can understand or at least communicate through. You might marry someone from another band, your children might disperse to other groups. Knowledge flows through these networks. Someone figures out a better way to have to spearpoint, and within a generation, everyone's doing it. Someone discovers a new plant with medicinal properties, and the information spreads. The genetic evidence backs this up. DNA extracted from burials at sites around the North Sea shows these were related populations, not a single homogeneous group, but a network of peoples who shared ancestry and regularly exchanged genes. Modern Europeans, particularly those from Northern and Western Europe, carry genetic markers from these Mesolithic populations. You're descended from them. If you're British, Dutch, German, Scandinavian, there's a very high probability that some of your ancestors lived in Doggerland, walked those hills, fished those rivers, and eventually fled when the water came. But that's still in the future. Right now, in this moment we're imagining, the world is stable. Yes, your grandparents talked about how the coast used to be farther south, how certain fishing spots are now underwater. But that's always been the way. The sea fluctuates. Some years it's higher, some years lower. You adjust. Everyone adjusts. There's no concept of irreversible change, no understanding that the land itself could disappear. Your life has rhythm, seasonality. Spring means following the deer herds as they move to fresh grazing. Summer means fishing, gathering plant foods that ripen in the long daylight. Autumn means hazelnuts, preparing for winter, maybe, hunting seal along the coast for their fat and fur. Winter means staying in sheltered valleys, living off preserved food, working on tools and equipment, telling stories. The stories are how knowledge persists, how your people remember. Stories about good hunting grounds and dangerous river crossings. Stories about ancestors and spirits. Stories that explain the world, give it meaning beyond mere survival. Some of these stories are probably sacred, told only at certain times, perhaps only by certain people. We know Mesolithic peoples had complex belief systems because we found evidence at other sites. Deliberate burials with grave goods, animal bones arranged in non-random patterns, suggesting ritual significance, the widespread use of ochre, which seems to have symbolic meaning across cultures. But the specifics, the actual beliefs, those are lost. We can see the traces of ritual behaviour, but we can't hear the songs, can't understand the prayers, can't know what they believed about death and life and the world beyond what they could see. What we do know is that they were successful. Mesolithic populations around Doggerland and the surrounding areas thrived for thousands of years. This wasn't a marginal existence. This was a sustainable way of life that worked, that provided not just survival, but quality of life. These people had leisure time, time to make art, to develop craft skills beyond mere utility, to socialize, to play. Children had childhoods. Elders were cared for. Communities functioned. The population density in Doggerland was probably higher than in surrounding regions because the resource base was so rich. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands of people, though spread across that enormous territory, you'd rarely see crowding. Maybe a few dozen bands in a given region, each maintaining their own territories, their own seasonal rounds, but recognizing each other's rights, cooperating when it made sense, keeping social bonds active through trade and intermarriage. And here's something important. These people weren't static. They weren't frozen in time, unchanging for millennia. Technology evolved, techniques improved, cultural practices shifted. Over the 2,000 years we're talking about, from 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC, there were changes. Tool styles evolved. New materials were exploited. Settlement patterns shifted as populations grew and adjusted to changing resources. They were, in other words, fully human. Living, adapting, innovating. Not primitive precursors to real civilization, but people living lives as complex and meaningful as any modern life, just in different material circumstances. They loved. They grieved. They hoped for good hunting and feared hunger. They told jokes and held grudges and formed friendships and raised children who would carry their knowledge forward. And they had no idea that the world they knew, this paradise of abundance at the heart of Mesolithic Europe, was temporary. That the same climate warming that had made Doggerland habitable was also slowly and inexorably destroying it. That the ice sheets far to the north were melting, releasing their water, raising global sea levels centimetre by centimetre, year by year, century by century. That eventually the sea would claim everything. their campsites, their hunting grounds, their sacred places, their stories. All of it would go beneath the waves, and for 8,000 years the world would forget they ever existed. But to understand what happened to Doggerland, to understand why it drowned, we need to pull back from the human scale. We need to think in geological time, in forces so vast they reshape continents, in processes that take millennia to unfold. Because what destroyed Doggerland wasn't an earthquake or a volcano or a war, it was ice, or rather, the absence of ice. The melting of frozen water that had been locked away for 100,000 years. Go back further, 20,000 years before the Mesolithic peoples were fishing in Doggerland's rivers. 20,000 BCE, the height of the last glacial maximum. The Earth is a different planet. Not literally, obviously, but if you could see it from space, you'd barely recognize it. The ice sheets are enormous, unimaginable. The Scandinavian ice sheet covers everything from the British Isles across to Russia. In some places it's 3 kilometers thick, 3,000 meters of solid ice pressing down on the bedrock, warping the Earth's crust with its weight. North America has it worse. The Laurentide ice sheet covers almost all of Canada and extends south into what's now the northern United States. It contains enough water that if it melted today, global sea levels would rise by more than 50 meters. And there are other ice sheets, smaller but still massive. The Alps are buried. The Andes, the Himalayas carry glaciers that dwarf anything existing today. All that ice has to come from somewhere. Water doesn't just appear, it comes from the oceans, evaporates, falls as snow, accumulates year after year, century after century, until the snow compresses into ice and the ice builds into sheets kilometers thick. And as this process continues over tens of thousands of years, the oceans shrink. Not in area necessarily, but in depth. Sea levels drop dramatically. At the glacial maximum, global sea levels are roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. Picture a 40-story building. That's how much ocean is missing, locked up in ice. And this changes everything. Continental shelves that are normally underwater become dry land. The shallow seas around Europe, around Southeast Asia, around the Americas, all of them drain, turn into plains, forests, hunting grounds. The North Sea basin is one of these newly exposed areas. It's a relatively shallow depression in the European continental shelf, surrounded by higher ground. Britain to the west and north, the European mainland to the east and south. When sea levels drop 120 meters, the entire basin becomes dry land. All of it. The deepest parts, what would eventually become the deep channels of the modern North Sea, are just low-lying plains, river valleys cutting through marshy lowlands. The shallower parts are hills, plateaus, perfectly habitable territory. And as the Ice Age continues, this land just sits there, waiting. The ice sheets to the north make it uninhabitable for humans. Too cold, too close to the glaciers, too subject to harsh winds screaming off the ice. But plants can grow here when summer comes. Animals migrate through. The land exists, even if humans can't yet use it. Then, around 18,000 BCE, something shifts. The climate begins warming. Nobody knows exactly why. Changes in Earth's orbit, probably. Subtle variations in the amount and distribution of solar radiation reaching different latitudes. The Milankovitch cycles, they're called. Orbital mechanics determining ice ages. Whatever the cause, the effect is undeniable. The ice begins melting, not quickly, not suddenly, but inexorably. Summer comes, and the edges of the ice sheets retreat slightly. Winter comes and they advance again, but not quite as far as before. Year by year, decade by decade, the balance shifts. More melting than accumulation. The ice sheets begin shrinking, and the water has to go somewhere. It flows off the ice as meltwater, cascading in enormous rivers, creating lakes at the ice margins, and ultimately, inevitably, running back into the oceans. Sea levels begin rising, slowly at first, centimeters per century, but rising. By 15,000 BCE, the warming is unmistakable. The Scandinavian ice sheet has retreated significantly. Parts of Britain are ice-free for the first time in 100,000 years. The climate isn't warm yet, not by modern standards, but it's improving, and plants respond faster than ice melts. Tundra spreads across the newly exposed land, then shrubs, then trees, birch first, Hardy pioneers that can survive harsh conditions, then pine, then, as the climate continues warming, deciduous trees, oak, elm, hazel, and humans follow the forests. As the ice retreats, people move north. They're following the herds, the game animals that feed on the new vegetation, and they discover this vast new territory, Doggerland, now habitable, newly accessible, and absolutely teeming with resources. This is when the settlement begins. This is when Doggerland becomes not just land, but homeland. But here's the thing. The same warming that makes Doggerland habitable is also dooming it, because the ice keeps melting, and the oceans keep rising. And Doggerland, this paradise of abundance, has a fatal flaw. It's low-lying. Most of it sits less than 50 metres above the contemporary sea level. Some parts are lower. The river valleys, the marshlands, the coasts, all of them vulnerable. When you're living there, you don't think about this. The land seems solid, permanent. Your ancestors lived here. Your children will live here. Why would that change? But the change is happening. Between 15,000 and 8,000 BCE, 7,000 years, sea levels rise approximately 100 metres. That's an average of about 1.4 centimetres per year. 1.4 centimetres, less than an inch. You wouldn't notice that in a human lifetime. Stand on a beach at age 20, return at age 60, and you might not see any difference. Maybe the water seems a bit higher. Maybe that sandbar you remember is gone. But nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic, except it never stops. Every year, another centimetre. Every decade, another 10 centimetres. Every century, another metre. The coastlines retreat, slowly, imperceptibly on human timescales, but relentlessly. That campsite your great-grandparents used on the coast? It's underwater now, that river mouth where your grandparents fished. The sea has pushed 2 kilometres inland. That valley you knew as a child, it's flooded, turned into a saltwater inlet, and the people adjust, because humans are adaptable. The coast moves inland, move your camps inland, fishing spots disappear, find new ones. It's inconvenient, requires abandoning familiar places, but it's not impossible. Life continues. Just slightly further north, slightly more inland, generation after generation. But there's a limit to adaptation. And Doggerland is approaching that limit because the territory isn't infinite. As sea levels rise, the land area shrinks. The southern coast retreats northward. The western margins are eaten away. The eastern edges erode. Slowly, gradually, Doggerland is getting smaller. Those 100,000 square kilometres of territory are becoming 90,000, 80,000, 70,000. And it's not just about total area, it's about specific resources. The richest fishing areas are often along shallow coasts, estuaries, places where fresh water meets salt water. As the sea rises, these zones migrate inland, but they also change character. Some become too deep for traditional fishing methods. Others become too saline for the plants and animals that communities depend on. The easy abundance starts diminishing. The timeline matters here. For several thousand years, from about 12,000 to 8,000 BCE, the rate of sea level rise is relatively steady. Between 1 and 2 metres per century, that's manageable, uncomfortable, requiring constant adjustment but manageable. Communities can move, territories can shift. The cultural adaptation keeps pace with the environmental change. But the overall trajectory is unmistakable to anyone looking at it from our perspective. Doggerland is drowning, not suddenly, not cataclysmically, but drowning nonetheless. Every century, more land goes under. Every millennium, the geography is noticeably different. The river systems that drain the territory have to constantly adjust as their outlets move. Some rivers merge as the land between them floods. Others are cut off, turned into isolated lakes as the sea surrounds them. And there are complications. Sea level rise isn't perfectly smooth. It happens in pulses. During periods when ice sheets are relatively stable, the rise slows. But occasionally something triggers rapid melting. An ice sheet collapses. A massive glacial lake breaks through its ice dam and floods into the ocean. These meltwater pulse events can raise global sea levels by several meters in just a few decades. For the people living on vulnerable coasts, these pulses are disasters. Within a single generation, huge swathes of territory disappear. Communities are displaced. Traditional lands are lost. One such pulse happened around 14,000 BC, when North American glacial lakes drained catastrophically. Another around 11,000 BC, coinciding with a period of rapid northern hemisphere warming. These events didn't destroy Doggerland, but they accelerated its destruction. Each pulse took territory that people had been using for generations and turned it into seafloor. The geography of Doggerland made it particularly vulnerable. Most of the territory was within 30 metres of sea level. That sounds high. 30 metres is a 10-storey building, but in geological terms, in terms of Ice Age sea level fluctuations, it's nothing. It's the difference between land and ocean. And as sea levels climbed past the 50-metre mark, past the 70-metre mark, past the 90-metre mark below present levels, Doggerland was running out of room. By 9000 BCE, the southern and western coasts are much closer than they were 1,000 years earlier. The British uplands, once connected to Doggerland by miles of rolling hills, are now becoming an island, or rather, a peninsula. There's still a land connection, but it's narrowing. Eventually it will be cut. The English Channel, currently a river valley draining into the Atlantic, is flooding. Salt water is pushing inland from the west and south. Eventually it will cut all the way through. Britain will become an island, and Doggerland will lose its western anchor. The northern boundaries are similarly unstable. The marshlands that separate Doggerland from the open ocean are drowning. What used to be coastal wetlands, brackish zones rich with birds and fish, are becoming open sea. The coastline is simplifying, losing the complex geography that made it so productive. And here's what makes this especially tragic. The people living through this have no framework for understanding what's happening. They don't know about ice sheets or global sea levels or climate change. They know that the sea keeps coming, that the old places keep flooding, that they keep having to move. Some might recognise it as a trend. The elders might warn that the coast has always retreated, that it will continue retreating, but most probably just see it as the way things are. The world is what it is. You adapt or you die. They don't know that far to the north in Scandinavia, the ice sheet that dominated Europe for 100,000 years is in full retreat. They don't know that in North America, the Laurentide ice sheet is collapsing, dumping unimaginable volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic. They don't know that the warming that made their paradise possible is the same warming that will destroy it. All they know is that the sea keeps rising, the land keeps shrinking, and there's nothing they can do about it except move, adapt, survive. And for thousands of years, they do survive. They adjust their territories, their seasonal rounds, their settlement patterns. They share the shrinking land, maintaining their cultures, their technologies, their ways of life. They persist, but persistence has limits, and Doggerland is approaching those limits. By 8000 BCE, the territory has shrunk to perhaps half its former size. The southern coast is gone. The western connection to Britain is down to a narrow isthmus, soon to be severed. The richest, most productive areas are underwater. What remains is the higher ground, the central hills, the northern plains, still habitable, still home to thousands of people, but diminished, reduced, vulnerable. And then, around 6200 BCE, something happens that changes everything. Not the slow rise, not the gradual encroachment, something sudden, something catastrophic, something that will turn the remaining land into memory and transform a thriving landscape into a drowned world beneath the North Sea. But that disaster is still coming. For now, the people of Doggerland continue living, adapting, surviving, unaware that their entire world is about to end in a matter of hours. The centuries pass. The sea keeps rising. By 7500 BCE, Doggerland is noticeably smaller than it was just a few generations earlier. The southern coastline has retreated dozens of kilometres inland. Villages that your great-grandparents spoke of as coastal settlements are now stories about places beneath the waves. The western connection to what will eventually be called Britain is down to a narrow land bridge, maybe 30 kilometres wide at its narrowest point. You can walk from the British uplands to Doggerland proper in a day if you know the route, but everyone knows this connection won't last. The sea is eating it from both sides. The communities adapt. They always adapt. Coastal camps that have been used for generations are abandoned. The fish traps built by your ancestors, complex structures of woven branches positioned at strategic points in rivers, are now underwater, useless. You build new ones further upstream. The shell middens, massive piles of discarded oyster and mussel shells accumulated over centuries, marking favourite gathering spots, slowly disappear beneath the rising tide. You find new shellfish beds, establish new traditions, new gathering places that your grandchildren will remember. But there's a weight to it now, a a sense of loss. The old people talk about the world as it used to be, when the land was bigger, when the hunting was better, when certain valleys, now drowned, were the best places to find hazelnuts or catch salmon. They talk about sacred sites that no longer exist, springs that had spiritual significance, trees that marked boundaries, all of them gone, swallowed by salt water that keeps advancing. Some families move permanently inland, abandoning the coasts entirely. Why keep adjusting when the sea never stops? Better to settle in the high country, the central hills where the land seems safer, where you don't wake up wondering if this will be the year your camp floods. But others stay. They've always been coastal peoples. Their identity, their skills, their entire way of life is built around the interface between land and sea. They'll adjust as long as they can, keep moving back as the water comes forward. It's what their ancestors did. It's what they'll teach their children to do. By 6500 BC, Doggerland is fragmenting. It's no longer one continuous landmass. The lowest valleys have flooded completely, creating inland seas, saltwater lakes that separate the higher ground. What used to be a unified territory is becoming an archipelago. Islands of higher ground connected by narrow isthmuses, separated by ever-widening channels. Travel is more difficult. Bands that used to visit each other regularly find the routes flooded, forcing long detours or dangerous water crossings. The social networks that bound Doggerland's peoples together are straining. The western land bridge to Britain finally breaks. Nobody remembers exactly when. It happens gradually, then suddenly. First, the narrowing. The connection gets thinner every year, just a strip of marshy lowland connecting two higher regions. Then, during particularly high tides or stormy periods, seawater flows across it. Just temporarily at first. Ankle-deep water you can wade through. But each time it happens, it erodes more soil, cuts the channel deeper. Until one year, maybe around 6300 BC, the connection doesn't re-establish after winter. The channel stays. Britain becomes an island. The peoples there are cut off, isolated. They'll develop their own trajectories now, separate from their cousins in Doggerland and on the continent. And still the sea rises. Slower now than during the rapid pulses of earlier millennia, but rising nonetheless. Maybe 0.5 meter per century. That doesn't sound like much, but it's relentless. Every human lifetime, another 40 centimeters. Every 4 generations, another meter. The coastlines retreat, the islands shrink, the habitable area diminishes. Then, on a day in October, approximately 6200 BCE, something happens off the coast of Norway. Nobody in Doggerland knows about it. It's too far away, hundreds of kilometers to the north, in waters too deep for humans to fish. But beneath the North Atlantic, on the continental slope where the shallow shelf drops away into the deep ocean basin, something has been building. A massive underwater cliff of sediment, deposited over thousands of years as glaciers melted and rivers dumped silt into the sea. The sediment has piled up, layer upon layer, becoming unstable, too steep, too heavy, waiting for a trigger. The trigger comes. Maybe it's an earthquake. The region is tectonically active, faults shifting as the Earth's crust rebounds from the weight of vanished glaciers. Maybe it's just gravity, the sediment finally exceeding the angle of repose that keeps it stable. Whatever the cause, the slope fails. 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment, rock, sand and mud begin sliding, moving, accelerating. It's called the Storegga slide. Storegga means great edge in Norwegian, and it is great. One of the largest submarine landslides in Earth's recent history. The sediment mass is enormous, unimaginable. If you could see it, if you had some impossible viewpoint allowing you to watch the entire event, you'd see a section of seafloor hundreds of kilometers long simply collapsing, sliding down the continental slope into the abyssal plain 3 kilometers below. The volume of material is staggering, enough to bury entire countries, mountains of sediment moving, and when that much mass moves that quickly underwater, it displaces water. Enormous volumes of water. That water has to go somewhere. It forms waves, not normal waves, tsunamis, walls of water radiating out from the slide zone at hundreds of kilometers per hour, traveling across the North Atlantic like ripples in a pond, except each ripple is 10 meters high, 20 meters high in some places, carrying the energy of a collapsing mountain. Picture yourself on the northern coast of Doggerland. It's mid-morning. You're part of a small seasonal camp, maybe 15 people. Families who've come to this spot because there's a good beach for launching boats and the fishing is reliable this time of year. You've been working on repairing a fish trap. The weather is calm, cool, but not cold. Typical autumn in the North Sea. The sky's overcast, but it's not threatening rain. The sea is relatively flat, small waves lapping at the shore. Then someone notices something strange. The water is receding, pulling back from the beach. At first you think it's just an unusually low tide, but it keeps going. The water pulls back hundreds of meters. The seafloor is exposed, areas that are normally under 2 or 3 meters of water are suddenly bare. Fish are flopping in the shallows. Shellfish beds are completely exposed. Some of the younger people start walking out, curious, thinking this is an opportunity to gather easy food. But the elders are uneasy. This isn't normal. This isn't how tides work. Some of them are starting to move toward higher ground, calling to others to follow. Their instinct, honed by generations of coastal living, is screaming warnings. Something is wrong. And then you see it. On the horizon. A dark line where the sky meets the sea, except the line is wrong. It's too high. It's moving. It's not a line. It's a wall. A wall of water advancing faster than anything you've ever seen. Faster than a running deer. Faster than imagination. The sound reaches you before the wave does. A roar like thunder, but continuous. Building, getting louder every second. You run. Everyone runs. Away from the beach, toward the hills behind the camp. You're not thinking clearly, just moving on pure instinct. Behind you, the roar becomes deafening. You glance back once, and immediately wish you hadn't. The wave is monstrous. 20 meters high, a vertical wall of dark water filled with sediment and debris, churning white foam at its crest. It hits the beach where you were standing moments ago and doesn't slow, doesn't break like a normal wave, just keeps coming. It reaches your camp in seconds. The shelters, the structures your band had built over weeks of occupation, simply disappear. Erased. The wave sweeps over them like they never existed. Fish traps, boats, tools, everything gone, and it keeps coming, up the slope, chasing you. You're running uphill now, your legs burning, your breath ragged. The water is meters behind you. You can feel the spray, can hear the roar of everything being destroyed in its path. You make it to high ground, just barely. The water surges up the hillside and stops maybe 10 meters below where you're standing, your heart hammering, gasping for air. For a moment you think it's over. Then you look around and realize the water isn't receding. It's just sitting there. The entire valley below you is flooded. The coastline is gone. Everything is underwater, and then, impossibly, another wave comes. Smaller than the first, but still massive. 3 or 4 meters high, surging inland, pushing the floodwaters even higher. Then another. The sea has gone mad. Wave after wave, each one adding more water, pushing further inland, destroying anything that survived the first impact. This happens all along Doggerland's northern and western coasts. The tsunami radiates out from the Strega Slide in all directions. It hits the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands. It sweeps across the northern reaches of Doggerland, inundating low-lying areas, destroying coastal settlements. Evidence of this wave has been found in Scotland, sand deposits laid down by tsunami action 25 meters above current sea level. 25 meters. The wave carried beach sand and marine sediments kilometers inland, dumping them in locations that make no sense unless you understand what happened. The devastation is immediate and total along the affected coasts. Communities are wiped out. Not every settlement, not every person. Many people survive, those who were inland, those who made it to high ground, those who were lucky. But the death toll is significant. Hundreds of people, possibly thousands, dead in a single morning. Drowned, crushed by debris, swept out to sea. Entire family groups gone. Knowledge lost. Toolkits, carefully maintained over lifetimes, destroyed. Boats, essential for fishing and transportation, smashed. But worse than the immediate deaths is the landscape change. When the water finally recedes, and it takes hours, the world is different. Entire sections of coast are gone. Low-lying areas that were habitually flooded are now permanently underwater. Salt water has penetrated inland, poisoning freshwater sources, killing vegetation. The tsunami has rearranged the geography. River mouths have shifted. Beaches have been scoured clean or buried under meters of sand. Coastal marshes, rich ecosystems that provided crucial resources, have been destroyed or fundamentally altered. The survivors are traumatized. They've experienced something beyond their frame of reference, beyond their ability to explain. Some probably interpret it as divine anger, punishment for some transgression. Others might see it as a warning, a sign that the coastal life is too dangerous, that they need to move inland permanently. The stories of this day will be told for generations, passed down, transformed over time into myth, legend, cautionary tales, but the core will remain. The day the sea rose up, the day the wave came, the day the world changed, and here's the cruel reality. The tsunami, devastating as it was, isn't the end. It's a punctuation mark in a longer story. Because after the wave, after the immediate devastation, after the survivors rebuild or relocate or simply try to continue living, the sea level rise continues. The slow, inexorable rise that's been happening for thousands of years doesn't stop. If anything, it accelerates slightly in the centuries after the Strega event. By 6100 BCE, 500 years after the tsunami, Doggerland is noticeably smaller. The islands of higher ground are shrinking. The channels between them are widening. What used to be a land bridge you could walk across is now a strait requiring boats. The total habitable area is perhaps a third of what it was 2,000 years earlier. The populations are declining, not just from death, but from emigration. People are leaving, moving to the British uplands, now an island but still close enough to reach by boat. Moving east to the continental mainland where land is more stable, less threatened. Moving north to Scandinavia, the Great Dispersal. By 5800 BCE, Doggerland is barely recognisable. It's a scattering of islands now, the largest being what will eventually be called Dogger Bank, an area of higher ground in the southern North Sea. This island, maybe 50 kilometres across at its widest, is probably still inhabited. It's high enough to have survived the worst of the flooding, isolated enough to provide some protection. The people living there are the last Doggerlanders, the final holdouts. They can probably still see other islands on clear days, remnants of the world that was, but they're cut off now. Each island community is isolated. Trade is difficult, the social networks have broken down, and the sea keeps rising. By 5500 BCE, even Dogger Bank is shrinking. The coastlines retreat year by year. Storms wash over the lower areas, making them uninhabitable. Fresh water becomes scarce as saltwater intrusion contaminates wells and springs. The fishing is still good, the island remains habitable, but it's clear to anyone paying attention that this is temporary, that eventually the sea will take this too. By 5000 BCE, the habitable area of Dogger Bank is down to perhaps 20 square kilometres. A hill, really. An island hill surrounded by increasingly aggressive seas. The population is probably down to a few dozen people at most. Maybe just a few families clinging to ancestral land, refusing to leave. Or maybe they have nowhere else to go. Maybe they've been here so long, generations upon generations, that leaving is unthinkable. This is home, even as home shrinks. Then, sometime around 4500 BC, the last dry land of Doggerland goes under. Maybe it's a particularly severe storm surge. Maybe it's just the cumulative effect of century after century of sea level rise, finally overwhelming the last high point. However it happens, Dogger Bank becomes Dogger Bank as we know it today. Not an island, but a shallow submarine plateau, 20 to 30 metres underwater, hazardous to shipping, marked on navigation charts. A fishing ground where trawlers still occasionally pull up ancient artefacts, barbed bone points, worked flint, tools made by human hands 10,000 years ago when this was dry land. The people who lived on that last island, did they evacuate before the end? Did they see it coming and leave in boats, sailing to Britain or Scandinavia to start over? Or did some stay, stubborn or faithful or simply old, choosing to die with the land rather than abandon it? We don't know. There's no written record, just archaeological evidence that by 4500 BCE, Doggerland is gone, completely submerged, an entire country, an entire cultural heartland drowned. The Mesolithic peoples who lived there dispersed across northern Europe. Their descendants became the ancestors of modern Europeans. Their genes persist. Their DNA is in you if your ancestry traces to northern Europe. But their homeland is gone, covered by the North Sea, forgotten for 8,000 years until fishing trawlers started pulling up evidence that someone, long ago, had lived in places that are now beneath 100 meters of cold water. Doggerland didn't end in a day. The Storegga tsunami was dramatic, catastrophic for those who experienced it. But the real destruction took millennia. Slow drowning, generational loss, a world that shrank and shrank until there was nothing, left but memory, and then, eventually, not even that. Just silence, just darkness, just the sea floor, holding everything that was, waiting for someone to remember. For 8,000 years nobody knew. The North Sea was just the North Sea, a body of water separating Britain from continental Europe. Dangerous to sailors, rich with fish, frequently stormy, ships crossed it, fishermen worked it, nations fought over it, but nobody remembered that it had once been dry land, that people had lived there, that beneath the waves lay an entire drowned country. The knowledge was completely lost, not hidden or secret or suppressed, just lost. Because the people who remembered Doggerland dispersed when it flooded. They settled in new lands, told their stories to their children, but stories change. Within a few generations, the tales of the drowned lands would have become vague. Our ancestors came from the east, from lands the sea took. Within a dozen generations, they'd be myth. Long ago there was land where now there is only water. Within a few thousand years, they'd be forgotten entirely. Just another flood story among hundreds, indistinguishable from other legends about catastrophic inundations. By the time of the Romans, 2,000 years ago, nobody remembered Doggerland at all. Classical geographers mapped the North Sea. They knew it separated the British Isles from the continent. They understood it was treacherous, difficult to navigate, but the idea that it had once been dry land, that would have seemed absurd. Water was water, land was land. They didn't change places. The Middle Ages came and went, the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration. Ships crisscrossed the North Sea constantly carrying trade goods, armies, ideas. Fishermen from England, Scotland, the Netherlands, Denmark, all of them worked the North Sea, knew its moods, its dangers, its bounty. But none of them suspected what lay beneath their boats. Then, on a day in 1931, a Dutch fishing trawler called the Kalinda was working east of the Wash, that large bay on England's eastern coast. The Kalinda was dragging its nets across the seafloor, the way trawlers do, scraping along the bottom to catch flatfish and whatever else was down there. The depth was about 40 meters, not especially deep, standard fishing grounds. When the crew hauled in the nets and sorted the catch, they found something unusual. Among the fish and mud and rocks was a piece of worked bone, not recent bone. This was old, stained dark by sediment, heavy with mineralization, but clearly shaped by tools. It was roughly 15 centimeters long, carved from what looked like deer antler. One edge had barbs cut into it, 6 of them angled backward. A harpoon point, a fishing spear. Someone had made this with stone tools, carefully carving each barb, shaping the base for hafting to a wooden shaft. The crew knew it was old, but how old? And more puzzling, what was it doing on the bottom of the North Sea? The nearest coast was over 100 kilometers away. Had it fallen off a boat? But it clearly wasn't recent. The patina, the weight, the mineralization, all of it suggested great age. The captain, a man with more curiosity than most, kept the artifact. Eventually it made its way to a museum in Leiden, Netherlands. Scientists examined it. Carbon dating, a technology that wouldn't be developed until the 1950s, wasn't available yet. But based on the style, the craftsmanship, the way it was made, they estimated it was Mesolithic, which meant it was at least 8,000 years old, maybe older. That raised the obvious question: how does an 8,000-year-old fishing spear end up on the bottom of the North Sea, far from any coast? There was only one explanation that made sense. When the spear was made, when someone used it to fish, that location wasn't underwater, it was dry land. The finding was published in archaeological journals. It caused some interest, but not much. One artifact could be explained away. Maybe it had been dropped from a boat in more recent times. Maybe it had been transported somehow. The idea that the North Sea had once been dry land was too radical, too strange. It contradicted what everyone knew about geography. But then, other artifacts started showing up. Over the decades that followed, from the 1930s through the 1990s, Dutch and British fishing trawlers kept pulling things up from the North Sea floor. More bone points, worked flint, stone tools, pieces of wood that showed axe marks, even fragments of mammoth tusk, suggesting that mammoths, extinct for thousands of years, had once walked where now there was only water. Most of these artifacts disappeared into private collections. Fishermen kept interesting things they found. Some ended up in pubs, conversation pieces. Look at this strange rock I pulled up. But some made it to museums, to universities, to researchers who understood what they were seeing. And slowly, gradually, a picture started emerging. These weren't random objects. They were evidence of human occupation, evidence that people had lived in what was now the North Sea for thousands of years. Geologists started paying attention. They had their own evidence that the North Sea had been different in the past. Core samples taken from the seafloor showed layers of peat, compressed plant material that only forms in terrestrial bogs and marshes. Under the marine sediments, under the layer of clay and sand deposited over the past few thousand years, there was peat. Lots of it. Peat that formed on dry land, peat that contained pollen from terrestrial plants, trees, grasses, the kinds of vegetation that grow in temperate forests and grasslands. The pollen cores were especially revealing. Pollen is remarkably durable. It preserves for millennia, and each species has distinctive pollen that can be identified under a microscope. When geologists analysed core samples from the North Sea, they found a clear progression. At the deepest layers, pollen from tundra plants, cold-adapted species from the end of the Ice Age, then birch and pine pollen, indicating the arrival of forests as the climate warmed, then oak, elm, hazel, the pollen signature of temperate deciduous woodland. And all of this was beneath marine sediments, which meant the forests had grown on dry land, then been drowned, covered by the sea. By the 1980s and 90s, it was becoming clear that something significant had happened in the North Sea, that it hadn't always been water, that there had been land there, inhabited land, which had been inundated thousands of years ago. But the evidence was scattered, fragmentary. No one had pulled it all together into a coherent narrative. That changed in 1998. A British archaeologist named Brian E. Coles published a paper titled Doggerland, a Speculative Survey. The paper synthesized all the available evidence, the artifacts, the geological data, the pollen cores, the sonar surveys that showed ancient river valleys on the seafloor, and Coles gave the drowned land a name, Doggerland. After the Dogger Bank, that shallow area in the southern North Sea named after the Dutch Dogger fishing boats that worked there for centuries. Coles' paper transformed Doggerland from a curiosity into a serious research topic. She proposed that this hadn't been just a land bridge connecting Britain to Europe. It had been a substantial territory, possibly the most densely populated region of Mesolithic Europe. A cultural heartland. And its drowning, its complete submersion by rising seas, represented one of the most significant lost landscapes in human history. The paper sparked renewed interest. Funding became available for systematic research, and crucially, technology had advanced to the point where actually exploring the North Sea seafloor was becoming feasible. Not diving, obviously. The North Sea is too murky, too dangerous, too deep in most places for traditional diving. But remote sensing, sonar mapping, seismic surveys, all of these technologies originally developed for oil exploration could be repurposed for archaeology. In the early 2000s, a major project was launched, the North Sea Paleo Landscapes Project, a collaboration between the University of Birmingham and the University of St Andrews in Scotland, with support from oil companies who were already conducting seafloor surveys for commercial purposes. The project's goal was ambitious, to map the drowned landscape of Doggerland, to see as clearly as possible what the land had looked like before the sea covered it. The technology they used is remarkable. Seismic reflection surveys work by bouncing sound waves off the seafloor and the rock layers beneath. Different materials reflect sound differently. Soft sediment, compact clay, peat, bedrock, each has a distinctive acoustic signature. By analysing the returning sound waves, geophysicists can create three-dimensional images of subsurface structures. They can see layers of sediment. They can identify buried river channels. They can map ancient topography that's been covered for thousands of years. And what they found was extraordinary. The North Sea floor isn't flat. It's not a featureless plain. Under the marine sediments, the ancient landscape is still there, preserved, recognisable. River valleys cutting across what had been plains, hills rising from the surrounding lowlands, the meanders of ancient streams, winding paths frozen in sediment, coastlines where the land met the sea 8,000 years ago, clear boundaries between terrestrial and marine deposits. They found the Rhine, the ancient course of the Rhine River, which today flows west through the Netherlands and empties into the North Sea near Rotterdam. But thousands of years ago, the Rhine flowed north, through the heart of Doggerland, fed by tributaries from the east and west, creating a major river system that drained a vast catchment. The main channel is still visible on sonar scans. You can trace its path for hundreds of kilometres across the seafloor. In some places it's 30 metres deep, a substantial river valley now filled with water and sediment. They found lake beds, depressions in the landscape that held standing water when Doggerland was above sea level. Some of these lakes were substantial, several kilometres across. They would have been focal points for human activity. Sources of fresh water, fishing opportunities, places where animals came to drink. Prime real estate for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. They found what appear to be coastlines, the ancient shorelines of Doggerland, the boundaries where land met the sea in various periods before final inundation. These show up clearly in the seismic data because there's a sharp transition from terrestrial sediments, the soil and peat that accumulated on dry land, to marine sediments, the clay and sand deposited underwater. By mapping these transitions, researchers could reconstruct how Doggerland shrank over time. They could see the progression, the gradual drowning, the land area diminishing century by century. And crucially, they found evidence of human presence. Not artifacts, not yet. Seismic surveys can't identify individual objects, but they can identify anomalies, structures, patterns that don't match natural geology, and in several locations they found just such anomalies. Linear features that could be wooden posts, clusters of harder material that could be stone arrangements, mounds that could be shell middens, those massive piles of discarded shells that accumulate at favoured coastal camps. These sites haven't been excavated. That's the frustrating part. We know they're there. We can see them on sonar, but actually accessing them, sending down equipment to carefully excavate and recover artifacts, that's incredibly difficult. The North Sea is a working sea. Shipping lanes cross it, constantly. Fishing boats drag nets across the bottom. Oil platforms dot the landscape. There are regulations, jurisdictional issues, the sheer expense and logistical complexity of underwater excavation in such a challenging environment. But occasionally artifacts still surface. In 2013, a fisherman pulled up a fragment of human skull, a piece of frontal bone, part of the forehead. It was encrusted with marine growth, but clearly human. Analysis showed it was Mesolithic, roughly 9,000 years old, and it showed evidence of possible trauma, a depression in the bone that could be from an impact. Was this person killed? Did they die in an accident? Or is the damage post-mortem caused by thousands of years of rolling around on the seafloor? We don't know, but it's direct physical evidence, a person who lived in Doggerland, a real individual who died there. Other finds have been equally evocative. A worked piece of auroch bone, the upper portion of a skull with cut marks showing where someone removed the meat. A red deer antler that had been fashioned into a tool, carefully ground and polished. Flint blades showing microwear patterns consistent with cutting plant material. Each artifact is a glimpse into daily life. Someone butchered that auroch. Someone crafted that tool. Someone used that blade to cut reeds or stems or hide. The mapping continues. New surveys are conducted regularly, adding detail, finding new features. The picture of Doggerland gets clearer every year. We now know, with reasonable confidence, what it looked like at various points in its existence. We can generate maps showing Doggerland at 12,000 years ago, at 10,000 years ago, at 8,000 years ago. We can watch it shrink, see the coastlines retreat, see the islands form as the highest ground becomes isolated. We know it was roughly the size of Britain at its maximum extent, maybe 120,000 square kilometres. We know the central region was relatively flat, crossed by rivers, with marshlands in the northern areas. We know the western margins connected to what are now the British Isles. We know the southern coast faced the English Channel, back when the channel was much narrower and shallower than today. We know the landscape was diverse, not uniform tundra or featureless steppe. There were hills and valleys, forests and grasslands, rivers and lakes, coasts and inland regions. The kind of varied topography that supports rich biodiversity and consequently dense human populations. And we know it drowned. gradually for the most part with one catastrophic punctuation in the form of the Storegga tsunami around 6200 BCE. We can see evidence of this event in sediment cores, a distinctive layer of sand, marine sand deposited suddenly in terrestrial contexts, the tsunami signature, preserved in the geological record. But here's what we don't know, and it's maddening. We don't know the details of human life there. We have artifacts, yes, but isolated finds. We don't have intact sites that we can excavate properly. We don't have settlements where we can see spatial organization, where we can understand how people lived. We don't have burials that would give us information about physical characteristics, health, diet, population relationships. We don't have art, nothing decorative or symbolic that would tell us about belief systems or cultural practices. All of that is down there, buried under marine sediments, protected by the cold, low-oxygen environment of the seafloor. In some ways, preservation might be excellent. Organic materials that normally decay within decades or centuries might have survived. Wood, leather, plant fibre, all the perishable materials that almost never preserve at terrestrial archaeological sites, might be intact in Doggerland sediments. But getting to them is the challenge. Current technology can survey, can map, can identify potential sites. But actually excavating underwater in the North Sea's conditions, with visibility measured in centimetres, in depths of 20 to 50 metres, with currents and tides and the constant risk of commercial shipping disturbing the site, it's incredibly difficult. A few small-scale excavations have been attempted. Most have yielded limited results, a few artifacts, some sediment samples. Nothing like the comprehensive excavations possible on land. So we're left with tantalizing glimpses, sonar images showing what might be a settlement, a scatter of artifacts pulled up by fishing nets, pollen cores revealing what plants grew, seismic surveys showing ancient river courses, pieces of a puzzle, but not the complete picture, not yet. Doggerland remains largely unexplored, a vast archaeological landscape, one of the richest in Europe, sitting beneath 100 metres of water, waiting for technology to advance enough to reveal its secrets fully. But even with what we know now, even with the fragmentary evidence, the story is clear. There was a land. People lived there. The land drowned. The people left, or died, or adapted until they couldn't anymore. And for 8,000 years the world forgot. Until a fishing net pulled up a barbed bone point, and someone asked the right question. What was this doing here? The answer rewrote history, gave us back a lost world, reminded us that the geography we take for granted, the separation between Britain and Europe, the expanse of the North Sea, none of it is permanent. None of it is guaranteed. The world changes. Land becomes sea. And beneath the waves, everything waits. The artifacts themselves tell stories. Each piece pulled from the North Sea floor is a voice from the past, speaking across 10,000 years of silence. They're fragmentary, yes, incomplete. But they're real, physical. You can hold them in your hands, feel their weight, trace the marks where stone tools shaped them. These aren't reconstructions or educated guesses. These are actual objects that actual people made and used, and then lost, dropped, abandoned when the water came. The Leiden bone, that first recognised artefact from the Kalinda in 1931, sits in a museum drawer now. It's been handled by dozens of researchers, photographed countless times, analysed with every technique available. But look at it closely and you can still see the individual tool marks. The person who made this, let's call them a craftsperson because that's what they were, started with a section of red deer antler, probably from a shed antler naturally dropped, because deer shed and regrow their antlers annually. Killing a deer just for the antler would be wasteful when you can find them lying around in spring. The antler would have been soaked, maybe heated gently over coals to make it more workable. Then, using a flint burin, a chisel-pointed tool, the craftsperson began carving. Each barb required careful work. Cut too deep and you weaken the structure. Too shallow and the barb won't hold. The angle matters too. Barbs angled backward create resistance when you try to pull the point out. That's the whole purpose. You thrust the harpoon into a large fish, a pike maybe, or a salmon, and the barbs engage. The fish can't escape. You can draw it in, hand over hand along the shaft without losing your catch. This particular point has 6 barbs along one side, Each one is roughly the same size, evenly spaced, carefully shaped. That consistency tells you something. This wasn't someone's first attempt. This was a skilled craftsperson who'd made dozens, maybe hundreds of similar points. They knew exactly how to shape the barbs, how thick to leave the base, where to create the groove for hafting the point to a wooden shaft. The whole piece is 15 centimeters long, tapered from base to tip, balanced. It would have flown true when thrown, or remained stable when thrust underwater, and someone used it. Used it until either they lost it, dropped it in a river or lake, or until the rising waters claimed the place where it lay. For 9,000 years it sat in sediment on what became the seafloor. Then a steel net scraped across the bottom and brought it back to light, back to air, back to human hands that could recognize what it was and appreciate the skill that made it. The worked flint is even more numerous. Dozens of pieces have been recovered, maybe hundreds if you count everything in private collections. Flint is stone, so it preserves indefinitely. A flint blade made 10,000 years ago looks essentially the same as it did the day it was finished. The edges might be slightly worn, dull from use or from rolling around in sand for millennia. But the overall form, the napping patterns, the intentional shaping, all of it remains clearly visible. The scrapers are common. These are thick flakes of flint, roughly oval or circular, with one edge carefully worked to create a steep, strong scraping surface. You'd grip the piece in, your palm, the worked edge protruding, and use it to scrape flesh from the inside of an animal hide. It's repetitive, tiring work, stretching the hide out, scraping methodically, removing all the tissue so the hide can be properly tanned. But it's necessary work. Hide is too valuable to waste. It becomes clothing, bags, bindings, cordage when cut into strips. Every piece of it useful. The flint scrapers from Doggerland show wear patterns. Microscopic examination reveals polish on the working edge, tiny striations from repeated contact with hide. These weren't ceremonial objects or symbolic items. These were working tools used hard, probably for years. When the edge finally became too dull to resharpen effectively, the tool would be discarded. And occasionally, one of those discarded scrapers ends up in a fishing net 9,000 years later, still showing the marks of the work it performed. The microliths are fascinating for different reasons. These tiny geometric pieces, triangles, crescents, trapezoids, rarely more than a centimetre across, represent sophisticated thinking about tool design. Creating a microlith requires excellent napping skills. You start with a prepared core, a larger piece of flint that's been carefully shaped. Then you strike off small, thin blades. Each blade is then snapped or pressure flaked into geometric segments. The rejected pieces, the fragments that aren't quite the right shape, would be discarded. But the successful pieces, the perfect little triangles, would be saved, accumulated until you had enough to create a composite tool. Setting the microliths requires precision. You'd carve a groove along a wooden or bone shaft, then position the flint pieces in the groove, spacing them evenly, fixing them in place with resin or pitch. The result is a tool with multiple cutting edges, any one of which can be replaced if damaged. It's modular design, the kind of clever solution that makes you realize these people were thinking just as creatively as any modern engineer. They weren't working with inferior minds. They were working with different materials, solving different problems. Several microliths from Doggerland still show traces of the hafting resin. Birch bark pitch, probably. A natural adhesive made by heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen. The pitch is black, rock hard when cool, but becomes sticky when warmed, perfect for hafting. And the fact that it survives, that 9,000-year-old tree resin is still clinging to stone, is testament to the preservation conditions on the North Sea floor. The bone and antler tools are more varied. Awls, sharp points used for piercing hide or leather. These are made from long bones of deer or other animals, ground to a point on one end, smoothed for comfortable handling. You'd use an awl to punch holes for stitching, to create eyelets for lacing, any task requiring a strong, sharp point. The Doggerland awls show the same wear patterns as modern reproductions, polish, on the tip from friction, smoothing on the grip area from thousands of hours of handling. There are barbed points other than the Leiden bone, some with single rows of barbs, others with opposed barbs on both sides, some long and slender, designed for fish, others shorter and stouter, possibly for hunting waterfowl or small game. Each style represents accumulated knowledge about what works best for specific purposes. The wrong point for the task means failed hunts, wasted effort, hunger. The right point means success. So the knowledge of which point to use when, how to make each type, that knowledge was valuable, passed down from experienced hunters to novices, refined over generations. One particularly beautiful piece is a section of red deer antler that's been carefully carved and polished. It's not a functional tool, or if it was, the function isn't obvious. One end is shaped into a blunt point. The surface is smooth, polished from handling. Some researchers think it might be a pressure flaker, a tool for working flint. You'd press the antler point against the edge of a flint blade and apply force, popping off tiny flakes to sharpen or shape the edge. But it could also be ceremonial, a baton, a symbol of status or authority. We don't know. What we know is that someone spent hours making it, grinding the antler against stone, applying sand as an abrasive, working the surface until it felt right in the hand. That effort suggests value beyond mere utility. The animal bones tell complementary stories. Not many have been recovered, but the ones we have are informative. Auroch, that massive wild cattle species that dominated Mesolithic Europe before going extinct in historical times. Red deer, the mainstay game animal across much of Europe. Wild boar. Elk. Each bone fragment is marked. Cut marks from butchering, showing where stone blades slice through meat and connective tissue. Impact fractures from breaking bones open for marrow. Burning patterns from cooking over open fires. One auroch skull fragment shows particularly clear butchering marks. Someone systematically removed the meat from the skull, probably the cheek muscles and tongue, both of which are dense protein. The cuts are deliberate, angled to follow the bone contours, avoiding wasted effort. This wasn't clumsy hacking. This was skilled butchery by someone who'd done it many times, who knew the anatomy, who could efficiently process a carcass. And there are fish bones. Not many, because fish bones are fragile, but some have survived. Pike, mainly. Large freshwater predators that would have been common in Doggerland's rivers and lakes. Some show cut marks near the skull, where someone removed the head. Others show evidence of splitting, the fish being opened for drying or smoking. Fish preservation was probably crucial. Fresh fish spoils quickly, but dried or smoked fish can last for months. That stored protein would have been vital during winter when fishing was difficult. Then there's the human bone. The fragment of frontal bone pulled up in 2013. It's immediately recognizable as human. The thickness, the curvature, the internal structure, all distinctively human. It represents part of someone's forehead, roughly 5 centimeters across. The bone is robust, suggesting an adult, probably male based on the pronounced brow ridge. Age at death is harder to determine from a fragment, but the bone shows complete fusion, so definitely an adult, probably at least 25 or 30 years old. The depression in the bone, that possible evidence of trauma, is controversial. Some researchers think it's a healed injury, a blow to the head that this person survived. You can see slight remodeling around the depression, new bone growth, which suggests healing. Others think the damage is post-mortem, caused by impact with rocks or fishing equipment during the 9,000 years the bone spent on the seafloor. There's no way to be certain. What we can say is that this was a person, someone who lived in Doggerland, probably around 9,000 years ago. They had a childhood, learned skills, formed relationships. They experienced the world through these eyes, thought thoughts in a brain protected by this skull, and now that's all that remains, a fragment. But still, a connection. DNA analysis of the bone fragment failed, unfortunately. The preservation wasn't quite good enough. But if it had succeeded, we could have learned their ancestry, their genetic relationships to other populations, possibly even their physical characteristics. Hair colour, eye colour, skin tone. That information is encoded in bone DNA if you can extract it. Maybe future technology will succeed where current methods failed. There's wood too, though less than you might expect. Wood decays, even on the seafloor. But in some areas where conditions are just right, where sediment buried things quickly and oxygen levels are particularly low, wood survives. Several pieces have been recovered showing clear axe marks. Someone chopped these pieces with stone axes, and you can see the distinctive pattern. Polished stone axes, which came into use during the later Mesolithic and early Neolithic, leave particular marks. The edge is relatively blunt compared to metal, so it crushes fibres as much as cuts them. You can see this under magnification. The wood fibres are compressed, not cleanly severed. One piece, recovered near Dogger Bank, is particularly intriguing. It's a section of oak, roughly 30 centimetres long, with notches cut at regular intervals. Some researchers think it might be part of a fish trap, one of those elaborate woven structures set in streams to catch fish passively. The notches would have held crosspieces, branches woven together to create barriers. Fish swim in but can't find their way out. Its elegant design, requiring no constant attention. Set the trap, check it daily, harvest whatever swam in overnight. But wooden artifacts are rare. Most wood is gone, rotted completely or degraded to unrecognisable fragments. What we're seeing in Doggerland's artefact assemblage is biased toward the durable. Stone lasts. Bone and antler last mostly. Everything else, the plant fibre baskets, the leather bags, the wooden spear shafts, the bark containers, the cordage, all the organic materials that made up most of Mesolithic material culture, it's gone. Disappeared. We know it existed because we find similar materials at waterlogged terrestrial sites. But in Doggerland, under the North Sea, even the best preservation has limits, which makes every recovered artefact precious. Each piece represents a tiny fraction of what once existed. Imagine a Mesolithic camp, 50 people living there seasonally. They'd have hundreds of tools, thousands of objects, spears, nets, bags, clothing, ornaments, containers, everything needed for daily life. But of those thousands of objects, maybe one or two survive to be recovered 9,000 years later. The rest vanish, return to Earth, leave no trace. So when we hold that barbed bone point from the Leiden, when we examine the flint scraper showing wear patterns, when we look at the fragment of human skull, we're seeing the improbable survivors, the exceptions, the tiny percentage that made it through millennia of submersion, sediment burial, currents, and the scouring action of fishing nets to reach our hands. Each one is a minor miracle. Each one is a voice speaking across time telling us, we were here, we lived, we made these things, we were people just like you, and this is all that remains. The collections continue growing. Every year new artifacts are recovered. More bone points, more flint tools, more fragments of a lost world. They sit in museums and universities, carefully catalogued, available for study. Researchers photograph them, measure them, analyse them with microscopes and spectrometers, and every tool modern science can provide. Each artefact yields information. Dates, materials sources, manufacturing techniques, use patterns, little pieces of knowledge that accumulate into understanding. But the artifacts also resist complete understanding, because they're silent. They can't tell us the stories that matter most. Who made this? What were they thinking? Did they have a name for this tool? Was this barbed point made by an expert, by an apprentice learning the craft, by a parent teaching a child? Was it made quickly out of necessity or carefully over many evenings as someone sat by a fire? Did the maker feel pride in their work? Did they curse when a barb broke? Did they sing while they carved? We can't know. We can study the object, extract every measurable fact, but the human context, the meaning, that's lost. All we can do is hold the artifact, feel its weight, trace our fingers over marks made by hands that have been dust for 9,000 years, and try to imagine. Try to honour the person who made it by remembering, by telling their story, as best we can with the fragments that remain. They lived, they mattered, their world drowned, but these objects survived. And through them, we can still reach across the centuries and touch, however briefly, the lives of people we'll never know, but who are, nonetheless, part of us. But artifacts alone can only tell you so much. A barbed bone point tells you someone knew how to fish. It doesn't tell you about the community that person lived in, the knowledge systems that made such fishing possible, the seasonal rhythms that governed their lives. To understand the people of Doggerland, we need to look beyond the objects. We need to reconstruct the culture, the economy, the social world that produced those artifacts, and that requires looking at comparable sites, places where Mesolithic peoples lived in similar environments but on dry land, where excavation is possible, where we can see not just isolated tools but entire living spaces. Starcar in Yorkshire is one such place. It sits on the edge of what was, 10,000 years ago, a shallow lake. A Mesolithic community used this location repeatedly, returning seasonally over several generations. Archaeologists have excavated it extensively, and what they found gives us a window into Doggerland. Because the people at Starcar and the people in Doggerland were the same culture, connected, probably related, using identical technologies, living similar lifestyles. At Starcar, they found a platform, a deliberately constructed structure built out into the lake, made from timber and brush, creating a stable working area over water. This wasn't casual construction. Someone felled trees using stone axes. Someone trimmed branches. Someone transported the materials to the lake edge and systematically built a platform large enough for multiple people to work on simultaneously. That speaks to planning, cooperation, shared labour. Why build a platform over water? For fishing, probably. For accessing waterfowl nests. For launching boats made from bark or hide. The platform gave them a stable base for activities that required being out from shore, and they maintained it, repaired it, used it for decades. You can see multiple construction phases, where damaged sections were rebuilt, where the platform was extended or modified. They also found hearths at Starcar, fire pits lined with stones, filled with charcoal and burned bone. These weren't temporary campfires. These were permanent or semi-permanent features, returned to repeatedly. Around the hearths, scattered tools, flint flakes from tool-making, bone fragments from butchering. The spatial distribution tells you about activity areas. Tool-making happened in one spot, food processing in another. Sleeping areas would have been further from the messy work zones, probably marked by different artifact distributions, though organic materials like bedding don't preserve, and they found red deer antler frontlets. These are remarkable objects. Someone took red. Deer skulls with antlers still attached, removed most of the skull except the frontal bone, creating a mask or headdress with antlers projecting forward. Then they perforated the bone, probably for attaching straps. You'd wear this on your head. The antlers would extend forward and up, making you look like a deer. Like you had antlers. Why? The obvious explanation is hunting. Wear a deer mask, move carefully, and you might be able to approach deer herds more closely. Deer recognize other deer by shape and movement. A human with antlers, moving like a deer, might be perceived as part of the herd rather than a threat. But it could also be ceremonial, ritual, dance, performance, expressing identity or status. We don't know the full context. What we know is that creating these frontlets required significant skill and effort. Someone thought it was worthwhile, worth the time, the work, the creative energy. The Starcar people were processing substantial quantities of animals. The bone assemblages show red deer dominating, but also elk, auroch, wild boar. They were hunting systematically, probably using composite projectiles, spears tipped with microliths, thrown with atlatls or spear throwers for greater force and range. The kill sites wouldn't have been at the camp. You hunt where the animals are, often kilometres away. Then you butcher on site, taking the prime cuts, leaving the heavy bones and less valuable parts. What arrives at camp is meat, hide, selected bones for tool making. But hunting wasn't the only food source. It probably wasn't even the primary one. Plant foods, when available, provide more reliable calories for less effort than hunting. And the pollen evidence from Starcar shows diverse plant resources. Hazelnuts are everywhere in the Mesolithic layers. Thousands upon thousands of charred hazelnut shells. Hazelnuts are excellent food, high in fat and protein, and they store well if kept dry. A productive hazel grove could feed a community for weeks. All you need to do is gather, crack, eat. No dangerous hunt, no risk of failure. They were also eating berries, various seeds, roots and tubers. We know because microscopic analysis of soil from hearths shows the residues. Starch grains, distinctive shapes that identify specific plant species. Cooking with fire makes many plants more digestible, breaks down toxins, improves flavour. The Mesolithic peoples understood this. They weren't eating everything raw. They were cooking, processing, transforming raw materials into nutritious meals. Fishing was crucial, as all those barbed points suggest. But it wasn't just spear fishing. They used nets, woven from plant fibres. They used fish traps, elaborate constructions set in streams. They probably used weirs, barriers across rivers that funnel fish into collection areas. All of these techniques require substantial knowledge. You need to understand fish behaviour, where they move, when they spawn, what depth they prefer. You need to understand water flow, how to position traps for maximum effectiveness. You need engineering skills to build structures that withstand current pressure. And these weren't solitary activities. Net fishing requires multiple people. Someone to hold one end, someone else positioned downstream, coordinating to surround a school of fish. Building fish traps is community labour. Setting them requires knowing the good locations, which implies territorial knowledge, probably handed down through generations. This stream section belongs to our band. We maintain the traps here. Others have their own locations, which brings us to social organisation. Mesolithic bands were small, typically 20 to 50 people, extended family groups basically, parents, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. But they weren't isolated. Bands maintained relationships with other bands, meeting regularly at certain seasons, certain locations. These gatherings served multiple purposes: information exchange, trade, mate selection. Young adults from different bands would meet, form partnerships, sometimes move to join their partner's band. The trade networks were extensive, that amber showing up at sites across Doggerland and beyond. It came from Baltic coasts hundreds of kilometres away. No single band travelled that entire distance. Instead, objects moved through networks. Band A trades with Band B, who trades with Band C, who trades with Band D. The amber passes from hand to hand, accumulating value with each exchange. By the time it reaches Doggerland, it's precious, exotic, worthy of being made into ornaments. The flint shows similar patterns. High-quality flint from specific sources, identifiable by colour and texture, appears far from its origin. Someone napped it into transportable cores. Someone carried it along trade routes. Someone eventually used it to make the tools we find scattered across Doggerland's drowned landscape. Each stone tool represents multiple human interactions, multiple points in a network spanning hundreds of kilometres. This tells us something important about Mesolithic society. These weren't desperate people barely surviving. These were people with surplus. Time and resources to invest in trade, in acquiring materials from distant sources, in creating objects of beauty and symbolism as well as utility. That amber didn't keep anyone fed. Those carefully crafted bone ornaments didn't help with hunting. They were about identity, status, aesthetics, about being human in ways that go beyond mere survival. The evidence of symbolic thinking is everywhere once you know to look for it. Ochre use is nearly universal in Mesolithic contexts. Red and yellow iron oxide, ground into powder, mixed with fat to make pigment. What were they painting? We mostly don't know because the surfaces they painted on are gone, but occasionally you find ochre on artifacts on bones, suggesting decoration, and burials, where they exist, often include ochre, bodies painted red, grave goods coated in red pigment. Red seems to have had meaning, significance. Death and red were connected somehow. The Mesolithic peoples understood their environment with an intimacy that's almost incomprehensible to modern people. Imagine knowing every plant within walking distance of your camp. Not just knowing they exist, but knowing when they fruit, which ones are edible, which ones have medicinal properties, which ones are toxic but useful for other purposes. Knowing where deer trails cross, where boar root for tubers, where auroch graze in different seasons. Knowing the landscape so completely that you can move through it efficiently, finding what you need when you need it. This knowledge was hard-won, accumulated over generations. Children learned by observation and participation, by following adults, watching, imitating, gradually building the mental database of information necessary for survival. There was no school, no formal instruction, just living, doing, absorbing knowledge through daily experience. By adulthood, you'd have a mental map of your territory that would rival any modern GPS system. You'd know hundreds of landmarks, water sources, good camping spots, dangerous areas to avoid, and you'd know the stories, the oral traditions that encoded this knowledge. Stories about the spirits of animals, about sacred places, about ancestors who did important things. These stories weren't entertainment, though they might have been entertaining. They were mnemonic devices, ways of preserving and transmitting crucial information. A story about a foolish person who ate the wrong plant and died teaches you not to eat that plant. A story about how deer behave teaches you hunting techniques. A story about where the first people came from gives you identity, connection to the land and to your community. The seasonal round structured everything. Spring meant following deer herds to fresh grazing, targeting the weak ones first, the ones that didn't survive winter well. It meant gathering early plants, the first greens, birds' eggs from nesting colonies. Summer meant intensive fishing as spawning runs brought massive numbers of fish into rivers. It meant gathering berries, preserving them by drying. It meant making tools, preparing equipment for winter. Autumn meant the hazelnut harvest, absolutely critical. It meant hunting for meat to smoke and dry. It meant gathering materials for winter clothing, hide processing, preparing for the cold months. Winter meant staying in sheltered valleys, relying on stored food, working on tools and equipment, telling stories, maintaining social bonds. But this wasn't a harsh existence, wasn't constant struggle against starvation. The resource base in Doggerland was rich enough that people had leisure time. They could afford to spend hours creating a perfectly crafted bone point. They could afford to decorate objects, to make amber beads, to invest in things that weren't strictly necessary. They had time to develop culture, beliefs, art. That's the signature of a successful adaptation, a lifestyle that provides more than bare survival. Population estimates for Doggerland are speculative, but some researchers suggest tens of thousands of people at the territory's height. Maybe 100,000. That's substantial for a hunter-gatherer population. Most regions couldn't support that many people without agriculture. But Doggerland wasn't most regions. The ecological diversity, the resource density, the perfect climate, all of it combined to create carrying capacity well above typical Mesolithic territories. And this matters because when Doggerland drowned, when the rising seas finally claimed it completely, those people didn't disappear. They went somewhere. Genetic studies of modern Europeans show clear ancestry from Mesolithic populations. Those genes persisted, which means the Doggerland people survived, relocated, integrated into other populations. Some probably went to Britain, making the journey by boat once the land connection was severed. Some went east to the continent, merging with peoples there. Some went north to Scandinavia. They dispersed but didn't vanish. They carried their knowledge with them, their tool-making techniques, their understanding of fish and game, their oral traditions, their stories about the drowned lands. Those stories transformed over generations, becoming myths, legends, cultural memories of a time when the world was different, when the sea wasn't where it is now, when lands that are now gone were home. And they left descendants. You, if your ancestry traces to Northern Europe, are probably descended from them. The genetic markers that identify Mesolithic populations persist in modern populations. Those people, who lived 10,000 years ago in a place that no longer exists, who fished in rivers that are now beneath 100 meters of seawater, who hunted in forests that drowned, they're your ancestors. Their blood is your blood. Their adaptation, their success at living in a changing world, that's why you exist. They survived the drowning, they adapted, they persisted, and 9,000 years later, we're still here. Still telling stories about the land that was lost, still marvelling at the bone points and flint blades they left behind, still trying to understand who they were, how they lived, what they knew, still recognising across all those centuries that they were people, just people, living their lives, loving their children, hoping for good hunts and plentiful hazelnuts. Not so different from us, not different at all really, except for the accident of when they lived. They got to see Doggerland. We only get to imagine it. But through their artifacts, through the evidence they left, we can touch that world. Briefly, imperfectly, but truly. So here's a question. Could they have remembered? The people who fled Doggerland as it drowned, who watched their world disappear beneath the waves over generations, could they have preserved that memory? Passed it down through oral tradition until it became the foundation of myths that persist even today? It sounds improbable. 8,000 years is a long time, longer than all of recorded history. How could stories survive that long? But oral tradition is more durable than you might think. Aboriginal Australians have stories that clearly reference events from the end of the Ice Age, coastal lands that flooded as sea levels rose. Those stories are at least 10,000 years old, preserved through dozens of generations, still told today. The details change, obviously. The stories acquire symbolic and spiritual meanings, but the core remains. The water rose, the land drowned, our ancestors fled. That basic narrative persists. Northern European mythology is full of drowned lands. The Welsh have legends of Cantreog Vaelod, a fertile kingdom that existed between Wales and Ireland, protected by seawalls and dikes. According to the story, someone left the gates open during a storm. The sea rushed in. The kingdom drowned. 16 cities, all the people, the king's court, everything lost beneath the waves. The story is recorded in medieval texts, but scholars think it's much older, possibly preserving memories of actual flooding events. The Irish traditions speak of Tír Fothuin, the land under the wave. Multiple stories describe islands or lands that once existed off Ireland's coast but were claimed by the sea. Some stories attribute the flooding to magical causes, curses, or divine punishment. But beneath the mythological overlay, there's a consistent theme: land that once existed, people who lived there, water that rose and took it all. Breton folklore from Brittany and northwestern France has similar tales. The city of Yiz, a magnificent coastal capital, supposedly drowned when the sea defences failed. The story says you can still hear church bells ringing underwater when storms disturb the depths. That detail, that specific haunting image of submerged bells, suggests a cultural memory of loss, of places that are gone but not forgotten. Germanic traditions have their own flood narratives. The Norse myths speak of waters that covered the world, though most of these are creation or destruction myths with cosmic significance. But there are smaller stories too, local legends about lands that the sea took, about islands that disappeared, about coastal settlements that exist now, only in memory and story. Could these stories, all of them, preserve fragments of actual events? Could the drowning of Doggerland, the slow, catastrophic loss of an entire country, have been so traumatic, so significant, that people kept telling the story even as it transformed into myth? It's possible, maybe even probable. Because here's what we know for certain. The people who lived in Doggerland didn't vanish when it drowned. They dispersed, and they took their stories with them. Genetic evidence confirms this. DNA analysis of ancient remains from Britain, Scandinavia, and continental Europe shows population movements that coincide with Doggerland's drowning. Around 8,000 years ago, around 6,000 BCE, there's a notable genetic shift in Britain. New lineages appear. These aren't people coming from distant lands. These are people with clear relationships to existing northern European populations. They're refugees, probably. People displaced by rising waters, relocating to higher ground, to territories that wouldn't flood. And they didn't just bring genes, they brought culture, technology, knowledge. The Mesolithic toolkit in Britain becomes more diverse around this time. New types of tools appear, styles that match artifacts from what's now the submerged North Sea floor. New fishing techniques, new ways of processing hide. These innovations didn't develop independently. They arrived with people who knew them, people who'd been using them in Doggerland before the sea took their homes. The same pattern appears in Scandinavia and the Low Countries. Around the same period, subtle shifts in material culture, in settlement patterns, in subsistence strategies. None of it dramatic enough to look like an invasion or wholesale population replacement. Just gradual changes consistent with refugee populations integrating into existing communities. The Doggerland peoples didn't conquer anyone. They just needed somewhere to live, and the surrounding territories, while occupied, weren't at carrying capacity. There was room, so they settled, intermarried, shared knowledge, and over a few generations became indistinguishable from the peoples who'd been there before them. But they remembered where they came from, at least for a while. The first generation certainly did. We came from the east, from lands the sea took. Their children would have heard the stories. Your grandparents lived on great plains that are now underwater. The grandchildren would have heard vaguer versions. Long ago, our people lived in a place that drowned. And so on, down through generations, the details fading but the core narrative persisting. The water came. We lost our land. We are refugees from a drowned world. Eventually, probably within a few thousand years, the stories would lose their connection to specific geography. They'd become myths about ancient times, about how the world used to be different. The Storegga tsunami, that catastrophic wave that hit Doggerland's coasts around 6200 BC, might have been particularly memorable. A wave that high, that destructive, killing that many people. That's the kind of event that gets preserved in oral tradition. The details would change. The wave becomes divine punishment or the result of magical causation. But the core, the massive wave that destroyed coastal settlements, that could persist for millennia. By the time these stories were finally written down, in the Middle Ages or later, they'd been transformed completely. The drowned. Lands become enchanted kingdoms. The catastrophic floods become morality tales. But underneath there might still be a kernel of truth. An actual historical event, preserved imperfectly but genuinely through oral traditions spanning 8,000 years. We can't prove this, of course. We can't establish a direct line from Doggerland's drowning to specific medieval flood myths. The connection is speculative, suggestive rather than definitive. But it's plausible, And it matters because it suggests that even catastrophic landscape changes, events that happen slowly over many generations, can leave cultural scars deep enough to persist as myth. The loss was meaningful enough to remember. Even when the details were forgotten, even when the actual geography was lost, the emotional truth remained. We came from somewhere that no longer exists. The sea took it. We survived. And this raises uncomfortable questions about the present, because sea levels are rising again, for different reasons this time. Not ice age glaciation and natural climate cycles, but anthropogenic warming, human-caused climate change. The mechanisms differ, but the effect is the same: coastal lands flooding, populations displaced, territories lost. The difference is that now we understand what's happening, we have the scientific framework, we can measure the changes, project future scenarios, understand the causes. But understanding doesn't stop the process. Greenland's ice sheet is melting, Antarctica's ice sheet is melting, glaciers worldwide are retreating, the ocean is warming and expanding, sea levels are rising, currently the rate is about 3 millimeters per year. That's slower than the rapid pulses that hit Doggerland, but it's accelerating, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. Even if we ceased all carbon emissions today, the momentum already built into the climate system would drive continued sea level rise for centuries. Low-lying coastal regions are vulnerable. Pacific island nations face existential threats. Parts of Bangladesh, home to millions of people, sit barely above sea level. Florida's coast, the Netherlands, major cities worldwide built at sea level, all of them facing the same slow catastrophe that drowned Doggerland. The water keeps rising, the land keeps flooding, and eventually people will have to move. The scale is different now. Doggerland might have supported 100,000 people at most. The vulnerable coastal regions today are home to hundreds of millions. The infrastructure is vastly more complex: cities, roads, power systems, entire economies built on the assumption that the coastline is stable. But it's not stable. It never was. We just happened to live during a period when it seemed permanent. And here's the thing. The people of Doggerland adapted. They survived. They moved inland, relocated to new territories, rebuilt their lives. Humanity persisted. But the adaptation wasn't painless. Communities were destroyed. Knowledge was lost. Cultural landscapes that had existed for thousands of years disappeared. The survivors carried trauma, grief for what was lost. That grief echoed through generations, transforming into myth, but never quite disappearing. We're better equipped than the Doggerland peoples. We have technology, global communication, the ability to plan and prepare. But we're also far more dependent on infrastructure, on systems that assume geographic stability. Moving a Mesolithic band of 30 people is logistically simple compared to relocating a modern city of millions. The challenges we face are orders of magnitude more complex. But there's something else we have that they didn't. We have their story. We know what happened to Doggerland. We can see, preserved in the archaeological record, what it looks like when an entire landscape drowns. We can map the progression, watch the territory shrink, see the settlements abandoned one by one. We have the artifacts, physical evidence of lives disrupted, of people forced to leave everything behind except what they could carry. We have the genetic evidence of dispersal, of refugee populations integrating into new communities. We have the complete narrative, and that narrative is a warning. Sea level rise isn't unprecedented. It's happened before, multiple times during the Holocene, during the Ice Age transitions throughout Earth's climate history. Coastlines are temporary. What seems permanent on human timescales is fluid on geological timescales. The people who built settlements in Doggerland had no reason to think their world would end. It had been stable for generations. But stability is illusion. Everything changes. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Doggerland sits beneath the North Sea now, a vast archaeological site that we've barely begun to explore. Most of it is protected unintentionally by the sheer difficulty and expense of underwater excavation. The artifacts pulled up by fishing nets are accidents, not systematic recovery. The sites identified through sonar remain largely undisturbed. This raises ethical questions. Should we excavate? Should we try to recover as much as possible before degradation or commercial activity destroys it? Or should we leave it alone, let it rest, treat the seafloor as a memorial rather than a resource? There's no easy answer. From a pure knowledge perspective, excavation is justified. We could learn so much. About Mesolithic life, about climate change impacts, about human adaptation to environmental catastrophe. The information has value, not just historical but practical. Understanding how past societies responded to sea level rise might help us respond to current challenges. But excavation is also disturbance. These are places where people lived, where they died, where they left everything they owned. There's something to be said for letting them rest. Current international law treats underwater cultural heritage as protected, at least in principle. The UNESCO Convention on Underwater Heritage provides frameworks for preservation and responsible investigation. But enforcement is difficult, especially in international waters or disputed territories, and commercial interests, oil exploration, shipping lanes, fishing zones, all of them take precedence over archaeology in practice. The North Sea is a working sea, protection is incomplete at best. So Doggerland remains mostly unexplored, a drowned country the size of Britain, sitting beneath busy shipping lanes and fishing grounds, holding the remains of a Mesolithic civilization, holding answers to questions we haven't even thought to ask yet, holding stories that could be told if we could access them, but for now, mostly just holding, waiting, preserved in cold water and darkness, not forgotten anymore, not since we rediscovered it, but not fully known either, a middle state between lost and found, between past and present, between memory and myth, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe Doggerland should remain partially mysterious, partially inaccessible, a reminder that not everything can be recovered, that some losses are permanent, that history contains gaps we can't fill no matter how sophisticated our technology becomes. The people who lived there are gone. Their voices are silent. We can find their tools, map their landscapes, analyse their genes, but we can't hear them speak, can't know what they called themselves, what stories they told, what songs they sang. That knowledge drowned with them, and maybe it should stay drowned. Maybe some things should remain in the deep. So here we are, at the end of the story, or maybe not the end, maybe just a pause. Because the story of Doggerland continues. Right now, beneath the North Sea, in darkness and cold water, everything is waiting. The river valleys are still there, just filled with water instead of air. The hills are still hills, just underwater. The campsites where families lived 10,000 years ago are still there, covered by sediment, protected by the same lightless depths that have preserved them for 8 millennia. The people who lived there, who walked those hills and fished those rivers, who watched their world slowly shrink as the sea advanced generation after generation, they're gone, but they're also here, in you, if your ancestry traces to Northern Europe, in the genes that persist, in the technologies that spread when they dispersed, in the myths and stories that might, just might, preserve echoes of their loss. They survived the drowning, they adapted, they persisted, and we're the proof of that. We're still here because they were resilient enough to leave, strong enough to start over, human enough to keep living even after everything familiar disappeared beneath the waves. Doggerland isn't lost, not really, it's just sleeping, like you should be, resting in the deep, holding its stories, waiting patiently in the darkness. The artifacts are still there, the landscapes are preserved, the evidence of lives lived, of communities built, of people who loved and worked and raised children in a place that no longer exists above the waterline. All of it is still there, just quiet, just still, just waiting. And maybe that's the comfort in this story, that even when worlds end, when catastrophe comes, when everything changes, humans persist, we adapt, we remember, we tell stories, we find new homes. The loss is real, the grief matters, but so does the survival, so does the continuation. The people of Doggerland are your ancestors, their strength is your inheritance. They lived through the drowning of their entire world, and here you are, thousands of years later, listening to their story. That's not tragedy, that's triumph. If you enjoyed this journey into the drowned lands, let me know where you're listening from. London, Copenhagen, somewhere else entirely. We're all connected to these submerged territories, all wondering about the world beneath the waves. Sleep well. Dream of hills that now underwater, of rivers flowing through darkness, of a country that drowned but never quite disappeared. Doggerland is resting, and so should you. Beneath the North Sea, everything is peaceful. Everything is still. Everything is waiting, like sleep itself. Not an ending, just a different state of being. Just a gentle descent into the deep, into the quiet, into the dark. Rest now. The drowned world is patient. It will still be there tomorrow, still waiting, still remembering, still holding the stories. But for now, just rest, just sleep. The tide is always turning, but tonight everything is calm, everything is still, everything is at peace.